Thrift stores are full of wood decor pieces, but they're often overlooked or left behind because they're outdated, damaged, or just plain ugly. So in today's video, I'm giving 10 of these forgotten wood finds a second chance. I'll share lots of ideas for transforming these boring pieces into stylish decor for your home. So if you like budget-friendly DIYs and spotting hidden potential, let's get started.
Let's start with a wood recipe box, an item that I often see on thrift store shelves. This one had an embossed design on the cover that I sanded off with my orbital sander. I didn't care for the light wood stain, so I gave it 2 coats of a pale green chalk paint. I like a distressed, aged appearance, so when the paint was dry, I sanded over the edges and corners. I wanted to add a vintage seed packet label to the top of the box, but I couldn't find one that fit the horizontal space nicely. So I used a Botanical book illustration instead. To decoupage paper to wood, brush a light even coat of Mod Podge to both the wood and the back of the paper. Smooth the paper in place and roll over it with a brayer to assure good adhesion. Once the Mod Podge was dry, I distressed the edges of the paper with sandpaper and then brushed on a top coat of Mod Podge to seal and protect the paper. Because I want to use this box to store seed packets rather than recipe cards, I used my Cricut machine to cut the word seeds from a piece of vinyl. To create a stencil, I removed the letters rather than the background from the vinyl and placed the remaining piece of vinyl on the front of the box. Then I used a small sponge dauber to apply green chalk paint to the stencil. I let it dry and then carefully removed the vinyl stencil. Again, to create an aged appearance, I lightly distressed over the lettering. And then to seal the chalk paint, I applied clear wax to all sides of the box. I also frequently see wood clocks at thrift stores, usually newer, cheaply made ones, like this clock. To give it a more substantial appearance, I'm going to attach it to this strange-looking wood box. First, I want to remove the clock face and the handle so I can paint over some of the cheap wood with black chalk paint. I decided to paint the sides and bottom, but leave the top natural on the clock and do something similar to the box as well. I thought the combination of painted and stained wood would look nice. The plexiglass was glued in place, so I just used a razor blade to scrape off any paint. Once the paint was dry, I sanded over the edges, but you can certainly skip this step if you don't like the distressed, aged look. Finally, I applied clear wax to seal the chalk paint. Then I was ready to join the 2 pieces together. I just centered the clock on top of the box and added a few brad nails through the inside bottom of the clock. The clock face was bright white and pretty generic looking, and I wanted something more interesting. So I carefully removed the clock hands and the nut below the hands to remove the clock mechanism. Then I printed out a vintage-looking world map on a piece of cardstock in a size to fit over the clock face. The current clock face was firmly adhered, so I just used spray adhesive to attach the map over it. Then I used an X-Acto knife to cut out the center hole and reassembled all the clock parts. Although there are no numbers on this clock face, The black clock hands are pretty easy to read. I popped the clock face back into the cabinet and reattached the small screws that held it in place. Finally, I reattached the top handle, which in retrospect, I didn't need to have removed. Small wood shelves like this are a dime a dozen at thrift stores. I didn't get it on film, but I used a screwdriver to easily pop off the little bracket under the shelf. Then I mixed up some dark green and blue paint to create a dark teal color in an attempt to match the paint on this vintage finial that I had previously thrifted. I painted both sides of the shelf, and while the paint dried, I removed the finial from its wood base. Then I used wood glue to attach the finial base to the underside of the shelf. I needed to split the finial in half before reattaching it so that the shelf would hang flat against a wall. There were numerous nails holding that finial together, but using the claw on a hammer, I was able to pull it apart. Then I used wood glue to attach half of it back in place. I let the glue dry overnight. The next day, I added a couple of brad nails to further secure the shelf to the finial base. I distressed the shelf to help it better coordinate with the rustic piece, and then sealed it with clear wax. The underside of the shelf had an indentation where the original wood bracket had been, but I felt it was too big to fill with wood putty. So instead, I decided to cover the bottom of the shelf with a piece of leftover peel and stick wallpaper, which I think will be an unexpected surprise. I cut a small piece of wallpaper, peeled off the backing, and pressed it into place. Then I used an X-Acto knife and sandpaper along the edges to remove all the extra paper. Because the piece of salvage was in such poor condition, I decided I better fill in some of the gaps on the back with caulk for extra durability. These wood candlesticks are unusual in both shape and color. The best part really was the wood on the bottom and top of each candle stand. So to freshen up those wood pieces, I lightly sanded them with a sanding block to get down to the natural wood. Next, I painted over the orange and blue centerpieces with a pale green chalk paint. I have a vintage Currier and Ives calendar print of sheep in a meadow that I wanted to use, but it was not as tall as the candlesticks. So I took a picture of it and enlarged it so that it was tall enough to cover the painted section of the candle stands. To save printer ink, I only printed out 2 sections from the enlarged image. To decoupage paper to wood, remember to apply Mod Podge both to the wood and to the back of the paper, covering both areas completely. Smooth the paper in place and use a brayer if you have one to assure good adhesion. Let the Mod Podge dry and then use a utility knife to cut off the extra paper. Then go over the edges with sandpaper to create a natural looking edge. Finally, seal the paper and the edges with a top coat of Mod Podge. This small storage box once held someone's collection of wine corks, but with its 2 plexiglass sides, it was a great find for under $2. First, we need to get rid of the writing on the sides and bottom. I sanded over them a bit and then gave the box 2 coats of black chalk paint. When the second coat of paint was dry, I lightly distressed the edges with a sanding block and then sealed the chalk paint with a coat of clear wax, dabbing away the excess with a rag. To create something unique to put inside the box, I grabbed an old doorknob from my stash and, using it as a small vase, I stuck a few stems of dried flowers in the hole, cutting them down so they wouldn't be too tall for the box. I turned the box upside down, slid open the lid, and put the doorknob inside so that it covered the hole in the lid. I love repurposing these wood picture frames covered with words and phrases. I'm going to completely cover the front of this frame with a piece of old wallpaper. So I only needed to paint the frame edges with ivory chalk paint to better coordinate with the wallpaper. The wallpaper's repeating pattern is large enough that nothing will actually be repeated on the frame, so it won't be obvious that this is wallpaper. I don't think that this wallpaper is pre-pasted, so the easiest way to adhere it to the frame is with spray adhesive. If you've never used spray adhesive, it's really sticky. So once you place the wallpaper down, there is no adjusting it. Smooth it out and use a brayer to remove any air bubbles or wrinkles. Just like I did on the small shelf, I first cut off the extra paper and then use sandpaper to smooth over the edges. I'm going to cover the middle of the frame with a mirror, but I removed the wallpaper from the center opening anyway, just to avoid future air bubbles. I'm just going to use a Dollar Tree mirror that I have on hand. It's really plain, but it's very lightweight, which is an advantage. Painting the mirror frame with chalk paint will help disguise the fact that it's made from plastic. Once the paint was dry, I used Gorilla Glue clear gel on the back of the frame to attach it to the larger picture frame. For an extra little touch, I cut a bird from the remaining wallpaper and matched it up with that same bird on the frame, and I cut out the portion of the bird that was hidden under the mirror. Then I glued that piece on the mirror frame so that you can now see the entire bird. I used Mod Podge to do this, but I think wallpaper paste would have worked better because it really did not want to stick to that frame. Once the Mod Podge was dry, I applied some clear wax over the painted frame. In my opinion, this wood bread box was overpriced at $14.99, but I did think it could be cute with a few small changes. I'm not going to paint the entire piece. I'm just going to paint the door to add a pop of color and break up all that brown wood. And I'm going to use a bold green color. At first, I planned to paint the wood handle, but then I decided I wanted to replace it with something smaller. Once the chalk paint was dry, I cut out a large rub-on transfer of 2 chickens from IOD's Brocante packet. Since this was a clean, smooth surface, it adhered quickly and easily using the plastic tool that comes with the transfers. The transfer looked a little too new and perfect next to the older wood, so I distressed it with sandpaper, especially on the edges and corners. Then I used some watered down antiquing wax to give it an even more aged appearance. And then I replaced the chunky wood handle with a skinnier metal one so that the chicken images could still be seen. I think I said earlier that these little wood shelves are a dime a dozen, and I came across another one, and this one was only 99 cents, so I had to get it. First, I painted it with a neutral colored grayish chalk paint, and while the paint was drying, I pulled out an IOD mold of Persephone. I dusted it with a little cornstarch, which keeps the clay from sticking to the mold. This is the biggest mold I've ever used, and I didn't initially pull off enough air dry clay. I had to add several additional pieces, which was not ideal. There were some creases or wrinkles in the clay that probably could have been avoided if I'd started with a bigger lump of clay. After removing any excess clay and assuring that the clay was reasonably level, I dumped out the mold on an old cutting board to let it dry. I had a little bit of clay left that I didn't want to waste, so I rolled it into 3 small bird egg shapes, an idea I got from Julie of Julie's Designs and Signs. After letting the clay dry overnight, I was ready to attach it to the small shelf, but I'm not going to use it as a shelf. I'm going to use it as a stand, so I removed the D-rings from the back. To attach the clay to the wood, I applied a good amount of wood glue to the back of the face. Then I situated it on the bottom portion of the shelf, making sure that the top point was concealed. I let the glue dry overnight, which also allowed the clay to dry out some more. The next day, I brushed white wax over the face and over the wood, and then dabbed off the excess with a rag. I repeated this process, this time using watered-down antiquing wax. And then, to blend out the 2 waxes and give it a more natural appearance, I lightly dipped a clean paintbrush in clear wax and then dabbed over the face like you might do to blend your makeup. I think Persephone's head slid down a little while the glue was drying, so I used a cutting blade on my angle grinder to carefully slice off that tip of wood. A solid wood lamp is always a good find, and if the weather was warmer, I might have stripped off the varnish and sanded it down to the bare wood. But since it's winter in Illinois, I'm going to paint it with ivory chalk paint. After the first coat, I realized that the crack down the side of the lamp was much more obvious than I first realized. So I filled it with some wood fill and let it dry for a few hours. Then I sanded it smooth and applied a second coat of paint. I wanted some of the wood to show through, so like I did in several of my previous projects, I distressed it with a sanding block. I wanted to cover most of the lamp with a rub-on transfer and decided to use a large William Morris design that I had previously ordered from Etsy. I cut it in half and then wrapped one of the pieces around the lamp. Due to the irregular shape of the lamp, I knew it was not going to adhere perfectly. So I tried to make sure that at least the front of the lamp lined up nicely. Applying transfers to curved surfaces is challenging. One thing I found helpful was to cut away the backing paper as I went along just to get it out of the way. Once the design was completely adhered, I could see that there were a number of wrinkles in the transfer, but this is easily remedied with sandpaper. So I lightly sanded over the entire lamp, which removed the wrinkles and distressed the image. The lampshade I want to use is ivory, not white, so I brushed watered down antiquing wax on the lamp so it would better match the color of the shade. I noticed while working on the lamp that the harp and socket were wobbly, so to tighten everything up, I found the nut on the bottom of the lamp and tightened it. I still had half of the William Morris transfer left, and I wanted to add some of it to the lampshade. I cut the remaining piece in half and applied the top half to the bottom edge of the shade. I made sure I placed it on the front of the shade, that is, the side opposite the seam. Then I cut a bird from the unused piece of transfer and added it above the floral design. Rub-on transfers actually adhere very nicely to most fabrics. For a finishing touch, I decided to add some lacy trim along the shade's bottom edge, just attaching it with hot glue. I thought this wood wall clock was an interesting design with the glass on the outside front. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, but I knew I wanted to paint it. So I first removed the clock, which was held in place with 4 small screws. Then I wanted to remove the glass, which was held in place by 4 short dowel rods. When I tried to tap the dowel rods through the holes, I ended up breaking the glass. And that's when I decided I would not be replacing the glass, but I did replace the dowel rods. I painted the wood frame with the same bold green paint I had used on the bread box. Once the paint was dry, I brushed on clear wax to seal and protect the chalk paint. The hole in the frame was rather large, so I found an old IKEA poster in my stash that was large enough to fill the opening. I cut it down to fit perfectly in the back opening and just attached it with hot glue in the 4 corners. The poster has some kind of shiny surface, so it should be fine without the glass. I wanted to make use of the dowel rods that stuck out from the frame, so I decided to wrap some faux vines around them, creating a circle of vines. Then I hunted through my crafting supplies and found a few faux butterflies with wires attached. I just twisted the wire around the vine to attach each butterfly. When I went to add a little hot glue to hold the vine to the dowel rods, a big blob of hot glue dropped on the poster. And of course, when I tried to get it off, it tore a piece of the image. So I ripped it out and then heated up the hot glue with my heat gun so that I could scrape out the hot glue that had been holding the poster in place. And then I cut up another IKEA poster to fit inside instead. This time I was very careful with the glue gun because this was my last IKEA poster. Thank you so much for watching today. And here's another video I think you may enjoy, where I share unexpected ideas for upcycling and repurposing thrift store clocks.